Hi, I'm Dave Edwards with Service Department here at Precision Camera, and I'm here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what to look for if you're buying an old camera, or if you find one in the closet, or maybe a relative gives you one. I can tell you right now, most of these cameras that we see, 8 out of 10 of them will need some sort of servicing to get them back in working order. And frankly, a number of them would come in and they're just too far gone to really fix in any economical manner. One of the things I want to warn you about is if you're shopping online and you want to buy a camera, you see a camera you like, be sure the seller has a return policy so you can get your money back if the camera doesn't work. Again, a lot of the sellers online, they'll get them at garage sales, they'll get them estate sales, that type of thing. And they may not know that the camera is not working or something's wrong with it, even though some of it may work. So if you can't actually lay hands on the camera, hold it, and do some tests yourself, make sure you get a camera online with a return policy. All right, let's go to the close-up, please. Okay, some basic things to look for if you're buying a camera that you can actually touch. First of all, the general overall look of it. Are all the parts there? Is there any corrosion? This particular camera, you may notice, missing the rewind lever. It's missing a part. That's fairly easily replaced. There's some dirt, some little surface corrosion is no big deal. You can expect that. But if the camera has a very distinct musky mildew smell, it's probably been in a really bad environment. So you don't, that's a bad sign. You don't want to have a camera that's been stored like in an attic where it goes to 150 degrees in the summer and is very damp in the winter. One of the first things you need to look at on an old camera, open up the back, the film compartment, and the film door. Let's see if this shows up very well. Is the light seals. Most of these 35mm cameras will have foam at the hinge point and foam down these light channels here and here. And the foam is generally one of the first things that deteriorates in these film cameras. It'll last typically in Austin weather maybe 10 years, 15 years. And you can tell it's bad. Generally it'll change color. It should be really, really black. And it'll either scrape off, flake off, or it'll turn into a black goo. Could we have the first still, please? Okay, there's a better picture where you can see we've got a toothpick kind of scraping it out. Typically, this is the way it will deteriorate. Sometimes it just turns to kind of like a black tar, and sometimes it's dry. It just depends on the conditions it's been stored in and the temperature range it's been subjected to. All right, let's go back live. Close-up is fine. All right, another thing you should look out for, and it's easy to detect without doing a lot, is battery corrosion. Now this camera, you can just barely see the battery compartment. There's a little discoloration. If I take the battery cap off, there we go. You can see down the battery compartment also the battery cap itself has a lot of discoloration. It's generally a whitish or a bluish color depending on what the battery cap and contact are made of. This is a definite red flag that comes up if you see battery corrosion. And this is really, really common. Let's go to the next slide, please. Next still. Got some better pictures of battery corrosion. We're up. Okay. This is actually the same model camera with really serious battery corrosion. It's actually starting to eat through the bottom cover. And unfortunately what happens, a lot of these cameras have been stored with a battery in them. And over the course of time, it doesn't take very long, but many of these cameras are 20 years old or more since they've been last used. You'll get severe battery corrosion. This would be something it would make me very wary of buying the camera. Sometimes you can, if it's a very light corrosion, you sometimes clean it up and it may work. But a lot of times the battery, the electrolyte in the battery leaks out and it works its way up the wiring into the metering circuit and electronics of the camera. Okay, here's another photo. This is a real serious, pretty serious case of battery corrosion. These are alkaline batteries. Typically, when they leak and corrode, it's almost always a white, grayish-white residue. A lot of these old cameras use mercury batteries, and when their electrolyte leaks out, it eats into the contacts and leaves kind of a turquoise, bluish turquoise or greenish residue. That's actually a copper salt. Most of the contacts, battery contacts in cameras are brass, and they're coated and are plated with nickel. And if you see this, basically I would recommend just moving on, waiting until you find a camera that's clean. Because generally, if you can see the corrosion, there's probably more up inside the camera. Okay. All right, lenses. Typically, okay, you'll see a 35 millimeter camera with what we call a normal lens. It's a 50 millimeter. Call it normal because it approximates your a normal field of view for a human. Lenses suffer from being stored badly. A few things you can check for. You can look at the front of the lens. Let's see what this looks like. Having a flashlight helps. Now you can see there's a lot of dust, thumbprints, that type of thing. Fortunately, this has a filter. That's a good sign. If you find a lens that has a clear protective filter on it, odds are the front element will look pretty good. A few dust specks, a few little minor scratches are not a problem. If you have major scratches on the front element, then you may have some issues with the scattered light, flaring, that type of thing. Also, inside the lens, you may find a couple of specks. If you just see dust specks inside the lens, that's really not a big issue unless there's an awful lot of them. Something that will cause you some problems, let's go to the still, is lens fungus. This is not that uncommon in the Texas area here. I see a lot of it, especially lenses that aren't stored very well, put in closets that are kind of moldy or some mildew's growing. It may get inside the lens. Certain types of fungus really like the coatings. Material in the coatings, they seem to like it and they'll eat it. And unfortunately, in the process of eating the coating, it releases fluoric acid, which is the only acid that can actually etch glass. So if it's there long enough, it can cause some considerable damage. If it's just starting, generally you can clean most of it off enough that it won't affect the image, but you have to disassemble the lens. In the case of a lens like I was showing you, it's not economical to really tear a lens down and clean it. And here's another, this is more typically what you'll see. Most of the time the fungus will start around the perimeter of the lens. It'll look like little, almost like little spider webs. And again, if it's just minor like this, this would probably clean up if you wanted to pay the money to have it torn down and cleaned. Okay, let's go back to the close-up camera. Okay, another thing you want to check, let's get another lens here, is the diaphragm. This is the other thing that we see a lot of problems with. And let's see if you can see that. Yeah, you can get there. There's the diaphragm inside the camera controls the aperture. The aperture is actually the whole, there we go. You see it changing. And that's minimum aperture when it goes all the way down, and maximum aperture when it's all the way open. So what you want to check, if if you take the lens off, there's a little lever somewhere on the lens. It varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. What you want to do is flick that and watch and see that it moves very quickly. And the reason is when the camera's taking the photo, mirror comes up. As soon as the mirror comes up, the camera will try to stop the lens down and the shutter will fire. And this all happens in milliseconds. If the diaphragm doesn't react instantly or basically as fast as it can, when the shutter goes, the diaphragm may not be closed far enough. And let's go to the next slide. I have a picture of what generally will cause that. Okay, this is a close-up of the diaphragm and the lens. You can see it's shiny. It looks like a liquid on the surface. Well, it is. It's oil. And the oil comes from the grease that's used in the focusing helical to make it nice and smooth. This generally happens because the lens has been heated, like left in a car, or it's been stored up in that attic. And grease is heated, the volatiles come out of the grease, and then when the lens cools down, the volatiles condense again, and it leaves an oil residue on the diaphragm blades. And those are supposed to be completely dry. So if you see that on your lens diaphragm when you're stopping it down, that's going to be trouble. So it causes overexposures. And again, you have to tear the lens down to clean it out. And in most cases, that's really not an economical repair. It's going to cost, typical lens is about $80 we charge to tear them down, clean them, reassemble and recalibrate the focus, that type of thing. Okay, let's see. All right, so let's go to the close-up, please. Okay, I'm going to put the protective filter back on this one. I want to talk about some specifics. There's all kinds of camera models. There are at least 10 or 12 back in the heyday of 35 millimeter cameras, which I put between the late 60s into the early 90s. That's when there was a lot of manufacturers. Each manufacturer had their own lens mount, so they had their own series of lenses. For instance, Pentax lenses would not fit Nikon's or any of the other cameras, and you couldn't switch around between brands. And even Pentax changed from a screw mount. This is a very early Pentax screw mount to later on they got what's known as a K mount, which is a bayonet mount. And it just turns about 90 degrees, mounts on the camera. These are both Pentax lenses, but they're not interchangeable. So be aware if you're buying a really early, this is a mid-late 60s camera Pentax made, and then they changed over, I can't remember exactly, I think it was about 1970, they changed over to the K mount. So if you're buying a Pentax, be aware that the really early lenses are not compatible with the later models. These, you're looking to buy a Pentax Spotmatic, a major problem on these is the battery corrosion, and the metering systems most of them don't work when we see them. Shutters, high speeds are generally not so good on ones that have been sitting a long time. And the cameras I brought are the ones that you're likely to run into if you're looking around at a garage sale or online or whatever. These are generally the ones that we get in. This is, like I said, a later version of the Pentax. Typical problems we find on these has to do with the mirror box. The mirror will stick, the shutter will hang. So due to some materials they used on dampening parts inside that deteriorates, turns to goo, and makes the levers stick in place. It'll jam the camera. Pentax probably was the fourth or the fifth most popular camera in that time. Okay, some other cameras. Canon was probably right up there, number one, number two, depending on what year it was. This is an early Canon TL, okay. And these, here's a battery compartment. Let's just take a look and see. That one's fairly clean. I don't know if you can see. There's no corrosion here, so that's a good sign. This one opens here. Most of the 35 millimeter cameras I'm showing you, when you pull up the rewind knob, the back will pop open. This one has a latch on the bottom. This is probably a camera from about 1965, and we can see here, if you look, the foam. Foam is bad. You're going to see that a lot. Things that go wrong with these, again, the meter on these cameras, the photocells get weak. Pretty much the same thing as with the Pentax Spotmatic series. The meters just aren't reliable. Mechanical part of the camera, again, higher speeds, lubrication issues, and foam. Later, probably if you go by just sheer numbers, the Canon A series is a camera you're very likely to encounter at garage sales, online. We sell quite a number of them when they come through here. And they started with an AE1. This is an AE1 program. I'll explain what program means in a second here. There's also an A1, there's an AT1, AL1. There's a whole series of these. As I remember it, they sold about 5 million of the A series cameras, which is a lot for cameras. This takes an FD mount, and they discontinued the FD mount in the mid-90s and went to the EF mount, which was for the autofocus cameras, and that's what they're still using today is the EF mount. So these are FD. The newer lenses are not compatible. Things to watch out for on the A series camera. Well, aha. The infamous Canon squeal. That's a sign that the lubrication internally is dry. That particular noise is associated with a braking system for the mirror. Keeps it from slapping up too high, too fast when you fire your shutter. If you hear that, you probably also will have additional problems with lubrication on the shutter mechanism and lubrication on the diaphragm control mechanism, which is used to control the auto exposure. The AE1 had an auto mode where you set the shutter speed and the camera would determine the best diaphragm setting, aperture setting for that shutter speed and the lighting conditions and the ISO you set. The program had an additional mode, full program, where you set it there and the camera would set both the shutter speed and the aperture needed to give you the right exposure. Besides the squeal, these also have the foam issues. You can look and see if the foam's any good. Most of these we find need foam replacement. And this is a battery compartment, something extreme latched points to it. We're back. the link. Test, test, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we need to move this. Let's see. I got a solid link. Test, test, 1, 2, 3, we're up. Okay. Looks like the audio went away, but we're back. All right. I was talking about popular cameras you're likely to encounter, some of the problems you might see. This is a Nikon FM2. There's an earlier version FM, which are limited to the shutter speed of 1,000th of a second. The FM2 had a shutter speed, maximum shutter speed of 4,000ths of a second, and a flash sync speed of 200th of a second, which is pretty high for a focal plane 35 millimeter camera. These cameras are sought after. This one, again, check the exterior. It's missing a lever for the rewind knob. There's generally not much that goes wrong with these cameras. If they're impacted, sometimes the metering system can be damaged. The typical symptom will be when you're looking in there and you're changing shutter speed, and you're looking at the finder display, the shutter speed doesn't change anything in the metering part. Another problem, pretty common on these, you can get a close-up look at that. The shutter, you see, has some nice, pretty honeycomb type. This was a Nikon first. They were trying to make this shutter run at a real high shutter rate, and they made titanium shutter blades. They're very thin and they're very brittle. And occasionally, one of them will get bent, get out of alignment, and it will stack when it's moving across the aperture there. and the result is it will break or bend the shutter blades. It can be fixed, but it's a big job. Later on, the later versions of this camera, they went to a hardened aluminum shutter blade, which was thicker. It didn't vibrate, get out of track as easily as these. I haven't seen any of those that have damaged shutters, but occasionally you'll see that. So if you're looking at a nice FM2 or an FE2, and it has that type of shutter, check both the shutter blades. You wind it, fire it, wind it again, and see that they're nice and flat. Nothing catches, nothing's binding. All right. Another popular camera is Olympus. I own 4 of these of the series, the OM series. This is the first one, the OM1. It's a little different from most 35mm SLRs of the day. It has a shutter speed dial right there. There are your shutter speeds, and there's your aperture. ISO set over here. That's not the shutter speed dial. These are really very lightweight. They have bright viewfinders compared to most cameras of that age. Main problems with these, battery leakage down here can damage the wiring going up to the meter, and that's a big deal to fix if you've got corrosion. So always check to see that there's no battery corrosion. This lens, I'm going to show you something here. Another thing to look out for lenses, we had the fungus, we had the oily diaphragm blades. The other thing that happens is, let's see how this goes here. Get to some light. There we go. You see that haze? Well, that's condensation from the lubricants inside. Again, it's the same stuff that ends up on diaphragm blades. And this is basically recondensed on the surface of some of the interior elements. And sometimes that can damage the coating. Usually you can clean it off. Some older lenses, you can see, if you see haze inside, it can also be a deterioration of the coating. We see that in a lot of lenses from the 50s and the 60s, not so much in this era of lens. This lens was probably made in the late 70s, early 80s. But the Olympus cameras are nice cameras, very light, like I said, and except for battery compartment, your usual light seal foam problem, and looky there, that's bad foam too. One thing peculiar to the Olympus and some of the early Pentexes is that they use some of that same foam in the interior. And one thing that will happen, let's get a close-up here. There's a strap that goes over the back of the prism, and there is a foam pad there, and that breaks down, that eats into the coating on the prism, and it ends up, if you look through here, you'll see kind of a dark, cloudy, or looks like maybe a spider web along the bottom of the image in the viewfinder. And that's because this coating has been eaten away by this deteriorating foam pad. The Pentex K1000 is also prone to that happening. Okay, well, that's about all I've got to say. Again, I would encourage you to, if you do shop online, be sure you deal with somebody who can give you a full refund if there's a problem, because like I said, 8 out of 10 of the cameras, or maybe 9 out of 10 of the cameras we see that people bring in for trade or for sale have issues. And it may be that the seller doesn't know enough about the camera to know that it actually has some issues. And also I'd like to remind you that we sell used cameras here, and we refurb them. We go through, check everything. We replace the foam. We adjust the meters, make sure the meters are right, make sure your shutter speeds are right, and we give you a warranty on them. So if something goes wrong, I think it's is it 30 days, is that right? 30 days on used cameras, yes. 30-day warranty, and you can return it for a refund or another camera, or if it's something we can fix, we'll fix it, and you got your camera fixed. All right, well, hope that's helped out, and come by and see us if you have any more questions about used cameras.